Act of 1935, Paper Federation, and the Princes the Act of 1919 had impressed neither any section of Indian opinion, nor the conservatives in London. The political agitations made it clear that Congress had to be allowed some share of power, without endangering British control over the central government. So fresh discussions for reform started in the late 1920s with a parliamentary commission appointed in 1927 under Lord Simon. But when the Simon Commission visited India, it was boycotted by all the political parties as it was wholly European and did not include any Indian member. In October 1929, Lord Irwin made a further concession by making an announcement that full dominion status would be the natural goal of India's constitutional progress, but in view of conservative opposition at home, it meant really nothing. The report of the Simon Commission was released in June 1930 and it suggested the replacement of Diarchy with full responsible government in the provinces, with the provision of some emergency powers in the hands of the governors, but no change was suggested in the constitution of the central government. Meant to protect imperial control over the centre, the proposal satisfied none of the political groups in India and could not be implemented because of the beginning of civil disobedience movement. Irwin again offered as a concession the proposal of a round-table conference to discuss the future system of government. But its first session, held in London between November 1930 and January 1931, was boycotted by the Congress. Here the nominated representatives of British India and princely states discussed the need for a federal government of India free of British control. But the conference achieved very little, as the conservative-dominated national government in power in London was not in a mood to take the federal idea seriously. Gandhi was then persuaded to participate in the second round-table conference in September to December 1931 on the basis of three vague principles of federation, responsible government and reservation and safeguards. But Gandhi's participation proved futile, as negotiations at the Minorities Committee broke down on the issue of https://telegram.me. Separate electorate, now demanded not only by the Muslims, but by the depressed classes, untouchables, Anglo-Indians, Indian Christians and the Europeans too. With the coming of a Tory ministry in Britain in September 1931, British official attitudes hardened even further. 16 The constitutional history of India again took a dramatic turn when Prime Minister Ramsay MacDonald announced his communal award in August 1932. It apportioned representation among communities and extended the provision of separate electorate to the untouchables as well. Gandhi, then in year of the jail, saw in it a sinister motive to divide the Hindu society, as the untouchables, he believed, were an integral part of it. The provision of separate electorate, he argued, would politically separate them and would permanently block the path of their integration into Hindu society. He therefore decided to fast unto death to reverse the arrangement. The nation panicked, although some of the depressed classes leaders like M.C. Raja favoured joint electorate. The most influential of them, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, saw in the provision of separate electorate the only hope of securing political representation for the untouchables. For more details see chapter 7.2. But Gandhi, though opposed to separate electorate, was not averse to the idea of reserved seats, and Ambedkar too ultimately agreed to it, as the proposed number of such reserved seats for the depressed classes was increased and a two-tier election system was recommended to ensure proper representation of such classes. 117 This became the basis of the Pune Pact of September 1932, which the government subsequently accepted. The third round-table conference in November to December 1932 was largely formal and unimportant, as only 46 out of 112 delegates attended the session. A white paper in March 1933 set up a parliamentary joint select committee with the provision merely to consult Indian opinion. The Government of India Act, which ultimately did eventuate in 1935, could therefore hardly satisfy anybody and was criticized equally by Congress as well as the Muslim League. In the provinces, In place of Dyaki, the Act of 193-5 provided for responsible government in all the departments. But this was balanced off by wide discretionary powers given to the governors about summoning legislatures, giving assent to bills and administering tribal regions. The governors were also given special power to safeguard minority rights, privileges of civil servants and British business interests. And finally, they could take over and run the administration of a province indefinitely under a special provision. At the centre, the Act provided for a federal structure, but it would come into effect only if more than 50% of the princely states formally acceded to it by signing the Instruments of Accession, which would override their previous treaties with the British Crown. The Act introduced Dyaki at the centre, but subject to various safeguards, and departments like Foreign Affairs, Defence and Internal Security remained completely under the control of the Viceroy. Another feature of this Act was the transfer of financial control from London to New Delhi, in response to a long-standing demand of the Government of India for fiscal autonomy. The electorate was enlarged to 30 million, but the high property qualifications only enfranchised 10% of the Indian population. In rural India, it gave voting right to the rich and middle peasants, as they were presumably the main constituency for Congress politics. So the Act, suspects the law, was a ploy to corrode the support base of the Congress and tie these important classes to the Raj. A competition for the allegiance of the dominant peasant communities, he writes, lay at the heart of the conflict between the Congress and the Raj at this stage. 118. Apart from that, in the bicameral central legislature, members nominated by the princes would constitute 30 to 40% of the seats, thus permanently eliminating the possibility of a Congress majority. Separate electorate was provided for the Muslims and reserved seats for the scheduled castes, a new term for the depressed classes or untouchables, in the provincial and central legislatures. Not unjustifiably, the Labour opposition argued in London that the Act only proposed to protect British interests in India by sharing power with the loyalist elements. The Act of 193-5 did not mention the granting of dominion status promised during the civil disobedience movement. However much die-hard conservatives like Winston Churchill might think that the Act amounted to Britain's abdication of empire, his colleagues had consciously chosen the federal structure because, as Carl Bridge has argued, it would act primarily to protect Britain's interests rather than hand over control in vital areas. 19. Its net effect was to divert Congress attention to the provinces, while maintaining strong imperial control at the centre. If any change happened at all, as B.R. Tomlinson has pointed out, the apex of the system of imperial control moved from London to Delhi. 120. The Viceroy was now to enjoy many of the powers previously exercised by the Secretary of State, and thus Indo-British relationship was provided with a new orientation that would best protect essential imperial interests. The significance of the Government of India Act of 1935 can be best https:// Summed up in the words of the then Viceroy Lord Linlithgow himself, after all we framed the Constitution of 1935 because we thought it the best way to hold India to the Empire. 121. The provincial part of the 193-5 Act took effect with the elections of 193-7, but a stalemate prevailed at the centre, perhaps as expected by the Tories, because the federal part of the Act remained a non-starter, as no one seemed to be really interested in it. The Muslim leaders, first of all, were afraid of Hindu domination and felt that the proposed federal structure was still very unitary. All the representatives of British India to the central legislature were to be elected by the provincial assemblies, and this would go against the Muslims, who were minorities in all but 4 provinces. So although they did not oppose federation in public, they certainly preferred decentralization, with a weak central government, allowing more autonomy for the provincial governments in the Muslim-majority provinces. 122 The Congress too did not like the proposed structure of the federation, where 1/3 of the seats in the Federal Assembly were to be filled in by the princes, thus tying up the fate of democratic India to the whims of the autocratic dynastic rulers. 123 But the federation scheme ultimately failed because the princes were reluctant to join it. Their main objection was that the act did not resolve the issue of paramountcy. The government of India as a paramount power still enjoyed the right to intervene in the affairs of their states or even overthrow them if necessary. Their other fear was about joining a democratized federal central government, where the elected political leaders of British India would have little sympathy for their autocratic rules and would provide encouragement to the democratic movements in their territories. Furthermore, the larger states did not want to surrender their fiscal autonomy, while the smaller states complained of their inadequate representation in the legislature. However, these concerns of the princes would become more meaningful if placed in their proper historical context. It will, therefore, be pertinent here to digress a little to tell the story of princely India since the outbreak of World War I. If the Curzonian policy of interventionist paternalism had strained the relationship between the princes and the Raj at the beginning of the 20th century, Minto's policy of laissez-faire again revived the bonhomie. The latter policy was intended to insulate the states from the sweeping political changes of British India and keep their people away from the rising emotions of nationalism. It was this isolation and political quarantine that gradually began to dissolve since the outbreak of World War I. The war once more showed https://telegram.me/upsc materials, https://telegram.me/freeopsk materials, https://telegram.me/material for exam. (328) From Plassey to partition nationalist posturing such as, not shaking hands with Europeans without his gloves on. In Bharatpur, where the local ruler was deposed due to alleged charges of financial irregularities, the combination of Congress, Arya Samaj and the Jat Mahasabha made this region a major centre of nationalism in the entire Rajasthan. 129 But, on the other hand, there were many other princes who remained loyal to the Raj and proved to be its most credible allies when nationalist challenge began to mount, when extremism and terrorism became powerful in the first decade of the 20th century and later when the non-cooperation movement rocked the subcontinent. The princes rendered valuable service in containing the Raj in their territories. The visit of the Prince of Wales, boycotted by the Congress, was made somewhat worthwhile because of the warmth and grandeur of princely welcome. In the 1920s, however, popular movements began to appear in all these states in the form of Praja Mandals. These mandals were eventually affiliated to a national body called the All India States People's Conference, founded in 1927 with its headquarters at Bombay. It raised moderate demands for democratic rights and constitutional changes, to which many of the princes responded with sharp vengeance and massive repression. However, if most of them were sensitive about guarding their autonomy and sovereignty, there were some exceptions too, like Baroda, Mysore, Travancore and Cochin, who had initiated, albeit in limited spheres, some constitutional changes. No, there were states like Mysore or Travancore here Congress politics had made considerable inroads. But Congress during this whole period scrupulously maintained an official policy of non-interference in the affairs of the states, ostensibly out of respect for the prince's traditional rights of sovereignty. The only exception was made in 1928 when a Congress resolution urged the princes to introduce responsible government based on representative institutions, and expressed its sympathy and support for the legitimate and peaceful struggle of the people of the Indian states striving to attain full responsible government. Such verbal sympathy, however, counted for little for the state's people's movements and for the clandestine Congress branches, which were dealt with stiff resistance from most of the princes. Therefore, when the civil disobedience movement started, the Raj's princely clients, barring a few exceptions like Bhavnagar, Junagadh or Kathiawar, proved to be as dependable as before in suppressing Congress activities in their respective territories. 133 So during all these years, the Raj had been using its subordinate allies representing old and, in British perspective, authentic India as effective tools against the new forces of nationalism in the provinces. Little was done to induce democratic constitutional changes in the states to bring them at par with the political developments in British India. This made the princes, unprepared to face the future, increasingly more alarmist about the nationalist leaders challenging their internal autonomy of rule. 134 This did not mean that the Raj refrained from intervening in the affairs of the states. Indeed, there were many officers in the political department who continually pushed the boundary of the powers of paramountcy, compelling the princes to clamor for an impartial inquiry into their constitutional status. But the Indian States Committee, which was formed in 1928 under Sir Harcourt Butler, scarcely provided in its report, 1929, any solace for the beleaguered princes. It gave them a concession in the form of a promise that paramountcy would not be transferred without their consent to any democratically elected government in British India, but at the same time, it reaffirmed the supremacy of paramountcy with unlimited power even to suggest constitutional changes in a particular state if there was widespread demand for such reforms. It did push the doctrine of paramountcy, a political department officer confessed, beyond any hitherto accepted limit. Thus pushed to a tight corner and pressured from both ends, the princes now started taking interest in politics and began to fraternize with some of the moderate politicians. They found in the idea of federation, first proposed in the Motilal Nehru report of 1928, an ideal way out of their present predicament. By joining an autonomous All India Federation they could escape the shackles of paramountcy, and at the same time could safeguard their internal autonomy of action. But not all princes were too sure about it, the Maharaja of Pariyala being the leader of this faction. Ultimately a mutual agreement known as the Delhi Pact was brokered on 11th March and was endorsed by the Chamber of Princes on 1 April 1932, projecting federation as a constitutional demand of the princes of India. But the demand was cushioned, as Ian Copeland has pointed out, with significant safeguards, which were sure to be rejected by both the British and the nationalists. They wanted, for example, individual seats for all the members of the Chamber of Princes in the upper house of the federal legislature, protection of their existing treaty rights, subjects to be placed under the jurisdiction of the federal government were to be mutually agreed upon by the member states, and above all, a right to secede. P.S. The British loved the idea of federation, as in that case the princes could act as counterweight against the nationalist politicians from the provinces, but their idea of federation differed from that of the princes. If in the first round table conference the representatives of princely India deliberated enthusiastically on a federation, by the time of its second session many of them had developed cold feet about the idea. At its Bombay session in late January 1935, the Chamber adopted a resolution, which was highly critical of the federation proposal as it had evolved by that time. When finally the Government of India Act got the royal assent on 2 August 1935, the federation scheme contained in it could hardly satisfy the majority of the princes. However, Ian Copeland, 1999, argues that the princes even at this stage were not completely rejecting federation, but were bargaining for a better deal. They wanted the instrument of accession to be defined appropriately to address their two major concerns, i.e., recognition of their existing treaty rights and protection of their internal autonomy. Although the new viceroy, Linlithgow, recommended some such changes, intense bureaucratic haggling delayed the process by several years. In the meanwhile, the spectacular political rise of the Congress after the provincial elections of 1937 made the princes panicky. In 1938, the traditional Congress policy of non-interference in the affairs of the states was jettisoned at the Haripura Congress, and in the following months the most vehement people's movement under the leadership of the All India States People's Conference, with the active patronage of the Congress, rocked princely India. For more details of this movement see Chapter 8.1. The smaller and middle-sized states were hardly prepared for this kind of popular upsurge, and they buckled in, taking a more conciliatory attitude towards the Congress. But the larger states fought back with resolute stubbornness, and they were helped by British troops. To the majority of the princes in 1939, the Congress had thus shown its true colours and could therefore never be trusted again. When in January 1939 Linlithgow finally gave them a revised offer, with some minor concessions, federation to most of them had become an unmitigated evil to be rejected outright. That is what they did at the Bombay session of the Chamber of Princes in June, and then, when the war broke out in Europe in August, the Secretary of State, Zetland, promptly put the federal offer in cold storage.